The step number one for executing the flawless cash call actually starts weeks, if not months, before the actual cash call, right? This is something that we've been talking about quite a bit, but you want to be, if things aren't going well, which is probably what's happening if we're talking about a cash call, right? We're not talking about well, even if it's an unexpected expense, things aren't going well, and you should be doubling or tripling down your communication with your investors, right? This is not something that should be suddenly sprung on your investors at the last minute. We talked about this. I talk about this a lot with Ken McElroy, because Kenny said this a long, long time ago, where, hey, if things aren't going well, this is not the time for you to stick your head in the sand. This is the time for you to double, triple, quadruple down on your communication. So if you've been communicating once a quarter on your reports, start communicating monthly, weekly, and daily, maybe if it warrants that. But you just don't want to have your investors be surprised. It's probably the easiest way to get through this. And so when the time arrives and you made the decision that we actually have to do a cash call, it shouldn't be a surprise to your investors. That's kind of the first step that you want to execute. Step number two is going to be trying not to do a cash call in the first place. Many of the top, I would say, not the top syndicators, but probably I think the best syndicators do everything in their power not to do a cash call right off the bat. And so generally that looks like the sponsors trying to contribute as much, or if not all, of the capital call first before they go to the investors. Now, this may not be a legal requirement, and I'll get to that in a second, but certainly best practices. Generally speaking, cash calls follow an initial attempt for the sponsors to plug the hole, at least for a month or two. Hopefully things will get better. And if they don't, then they go to their investors and say, look, we tried to do it on our own. We made a loan to the company. It's still insufficient. And so we need to do a cash call. So best practice, in my opinion, is for the sponsors to do everything in their power first to come up with the cash call on their own, sort of their own liquidity, before going to the investors. Step number three of executing the flawless cash call has to be reviewing the specific provisions of the operating agreement. Or if it's a partnership, your limited partnership agreement. I get asked all the time, hey, how do I do a cash call? What do I need to do? What steps do I need to follow? And every single operating agreement is going to be slightly different. I mean, ours is obviously, the ones that we do are almost all the same, unless the clients ask for a specific change. But you want to pay close attention, because that's what's going to govern. There's going to be a section, most likely in your operating agreement. There might be reference to it in the PPM, but it really is going to be in the operating agreement. There's going to be a section in there called cash call or additional capital contributions. And there's going to be a step-by-step or a guide as to what you need to do in order to follow it. And you want to make sure you're following that to the letter of the operating agreement. Generally speaking, let's go through some options, because obviously it is what it is. Whatever operating agreement you have, that's going to be the cash call provision. But just in the future, if I want you guys to be aware of all the different potential ways of doing a cash call, so that if you kind of don't like the way your current operating agreement reads, because you never really paid that much attention to it, I want you guys to know what the options are moving forward. So cash calls generally can be in the form of debt or equity. So sometimes cash calls are simply, hey, when we need a cash call and investors come in and provide capital, that's going to be in the form of a loan. So it's not going to be an additional, capital account increase. It's just simply a loan at X% that's predetermined. And that's the way you get the cash call. That's how you sort of reward your investors for bringing in additional capital. The other one is equity, which is probably the most common. I mean, I think the ones that we do are all equity infusions. And so what tends to happen is, let's give an example here. Let's say you've got a $500,000 hold that you need to plug. And let's just say for, I don't know, let's just say there's 10 investors in there. Everybody put in 50 grand or something. So if it's an equity infusion, then everybody who contributes an additional, let's say $50,000, let's say that's the cash call that everybody has to bring in, their capital account is going to go up by $50,000. And so if everybody contributes the 500,000, everybody's going to have an increase in their capital account. If everybody contributes the correct amount, there shouldn't be any change in the percentage ownership, because everybody's contributed. But what happens always, I don't think I've ever seen, unless it's a very small amount of investors, generally speaking, if you're looking at syndicators who, where you have 10, 15, 20, 40, 80 investors, there's always a few people, or maybe a lot of people, that either don't have the ability to make the cash call or just don't want to do the cash call. They just feel like, hey, I don't want to throw, in their opinions, good money after bad, so they refuse to do the cash call. And it's important to remember that from a legal standpoint, most syndication agreements, certainly ours, are written so that there is no mandatory cash call. And the reason you have that is because investors on the front end want to make sure that if I'm going to write you a $50,000 check, I'm not going to come, you're not going to come back asking for more. Like, that's my legal requirement. I'm putting in 50K. The most I can lose is 50K. If you started having provisions in your operating agreement that, oh, it's mandatory cash calls, then there's no assurance from the investor that the most they could lose here is 50,000, and it becomes a little bit more challenging to raise capital. So most operating agreements, the ones I've seen, and certainly ours, do not have a mandatory cash call provision. However, there are usually serious repercussions if they don't make the cash call. And the legal difference is simply that when the cash call is mandatory and they don't make the cash call, they've actually breached the contract. They've breached the terms of the operating agreement. When it's non-mandatory, they haven't breached. There's just certain consequences for them not actually providing the cash call. And the consequences are usually one of two scenarios, or maybe both. And I think in ours, we have a separate provision, but there's two options. One is simply that if somebody does not provide the cash call, then another member, so let's go back to my example. You got a $500,000 cash call. Everybody needs to put in 50K. Two people decide not to. So you've only got 400K, you're 100K short. Their provisions typically allow for other members to come up and step up and put additional capital more than everybody else. But in exchange for that, not only will their capital accounts go up, but the percentage ownership will then be adjusted to account for that. So if I'm putting in $100,000 versus everybody else putting $50,000, then my ownership percentage is going to go from 10% to whatever the math is, 12%, 13%. So there's actually a dilution of the non-contributing member, because they own 10% before the cash call. They didn't make it. Now they're going to own 8 or 7 or 6 or whatever, right? Generally, if the member's going to make the cash call, the dilution isn't that big. The major dilution happens a little bit further down the road, which I'll get to in a second. The other option that you might see is, instead of having it as an additional sort of equity infusion in the form of percentage interest, it might just be a loan. So there are provisions in the operating agreement where the member, again, let's say you've got two people that don't want to make the cash call. That means you're 100K short. Mauricio is one of the members. I can come in and sort of front or loan you the $100,000 or the $50,000, and I basically have a lien on your shares, right, of the non-contributing shares, so that if there's cash flow in the future, or if you end up selling the property and there's cash flow, then before the distributions go to that non-contributing member, they're going to come to me to pay off my loan and, of course, my interest, which is usually as punitive as legally possible. So it's going to have some language where the interest rate is going to be 15, 16, 18%, or whatever the maximum is allowed by law. So in that case, you don't actually get a sort of a direct dilution, but in essence, it's kind of like a charging order. If you think of it from an asset protection standpoint, somebody's loaning the non-contributing member the 50K, and they're putting a lien on the shares. So from now on, every dollar that was supposed to go to that member is going to get diverted to the person making the loan until that loan gets paid off plus interest. Now, if that is still short, the manager always has, if you haven't already from step number one, if the manager hasn't come in and given a loan of some sort, then the manager obviously has the right to step in as well and fill that gap. And the same rules would apply there that have a lien on the shares. But where it gets really, I'll say the right word, where it gets uncomfortable is when you've gone through all these provisions and you're still short, right? And at that point, the manager has to make a decision, and it's in the operating agreement that's in the best interest of the investors in the company, but they've got to make a decision, and they've got to find the capital somewhere, because if you don't find the capital, then you could lose the property, right? Your debt coverage ratio may go down, the lender may foreclose, it's pretty dire consequences depending on the situation. So you're going to have to go to the markets. Right, you're going to have to go to third parties and either get a third-party loan from a private equity group, which is typically what I see, or you may have to try and sell additional equity. And that's where the dilution really happens, because if you're trying to sell another round of equity to a private equity group, or maybe just a couple of other investors, the terms aren't going to be great, right? They're not going to be buying, let's say the shares were valued at $50,000 at the beginning of the deal. Nobody's going to come in and pay $50,000 for those shares. They might pay $25,000 or $10,000. And so that's where the dilution really kicks in. So somebody decides not to make their capital contribution, and the manager now is forced to go to a third party, private equity group, other investors. Then what's going to happen is that my 10% interest may go down to 5, 4, 3, 2, because at that point, the manager has to secure the funding at basically whatever cost necessary. Because if not, then they're going to lose the whole property, and everybody's going to lose all of their equity. And so that's kind of the extreme scenario, but that's kind of the last step that occurs. And we've gone through this where, private equity groups, they generally have pretty onerous terms, but When your back is up against the walls, those terms get even worse, right? So if you're dealing with a private equity group, you want to be dealing with them on the front end, right at the beginning of the project. You can negotiate good terms with them, and you can negotiate whatever you think is best for your company. If you're coming in now late in the game, sometimes they come in when you're short on a raise, right? But certainly when there's a cash call, it's going to be some pretty onerous terms. And you're authorized in the operating agreement because you've got, at that point, you've gone through your cash call provision, and it's basically failed. The members have decided as collectively not to contribute all of it. So that's probably the most dire consequences. But pay attention to the operating agreement. No, there's several ways. There's no one size fits all. So I encourage you guys to review it. And if you don't like the way the cash call provisions are written, or you hadn't paid attention before, talk to your securities counsel so that at the next one that you guys do, it fits whatever scenario you want. And maybe you want them to be mandatory too, by the way. That's certainly fine if you want to take that position. But just pay good attention to that. The other thing that's going to be in that operating agreement is the notice provision, right? So you're going to want to provide proper notice to the investor. So there's going to be a provision in there that's going to say, hey, this is how notice is going to be provided. You're going to have to wait X amount of days. And so again, that's something that you want to pay attention to. Step 4 of executing a flawless cash call is going to be drafting a corporate resolution, or in this case, probably a written consent if it's an LLC. You want to document from a corporate resolution standpoint, corporate record standpoint, this decision. You've made a decision that a cash call is required. This is a decision that's made at the sole discretion of the manager. You want to make sure that not only do you put together a pretty thorough written consent, or a corporate resolution, essentially, outlining all the reasons why, sort of justifying why, in your opinion, this cash call is warranted, and you are now hereby authorizing the company or authorizing the manager to go ahead and issue this cash call. It's an opportunity for you to really write a nice little sort of a diary almost of sort of your position as to what happened and what's causing the cash flow, and it's just something sort of to help you back up the decision. But it's also technically the document that really gives you the power to go out and do this execute. So I would definitely do a written consent. Step 5 of executing a flawless cash flow is communicating with the investors. Again, if we go back to step 1, it shouldn't be a surprise, but once you've made the decision to do the cash call, I would recommend that you then reach out to your investors before you start sending out that cash call communication, via the notice or the email or whatever you're going to send. Good practice is to either, depending on how many investors there are, if there aren't that many, pick up the phone, talk to them individually, let them know, hey, here's what's going on. It shouldn't be a shock to them. And let them know, hey, we're going to do a cash call. This is how much it is, and all this stuff. And it's just sort of a courtesy call. It's not required, but I think it just makes good sense from a relationship standpoint. And of course, if you've got 40, 50, 60, 100 investors, that's not going to be practical. So you're probably going to want to have a little Zoom call or however you guys are communicating. But just communicate to your investors and give them the heads up that they're going to be receiving a formal notice of a cash call, so they're not surprised when they open up their mail or their FedEx or whatever the mechanism is. Step number 6 of executing the flawless cash flow is making sure that you do issue that notice in compliance with the operating agreement. You want to be following. This is not a time to sort of wing it. You want to be, first of all, I probably should have added this into my steps, but I should have definitely added this to my steps. Early on in this process, you want to obviously be working with your securities attorney. I mean, they're going to be advising you. They're going to be reviewing that language and going through it with you. So definitely be talking to your securities attorney and making sure that you are following the operating agreement step by step. In fact, I would highly encourage you all to do that. Even if it seems pretty straightforward, I would definitely be checking in with your securities counsel. They're certainly going to be writing the corporate resolution, but you want to make sure that you're following the step by step. And there's going to be timelines, right? You're going to have a week or 10 days or 2 weeks or 4 days or whatever the operating agreement says when they have to give the cash call. So you want to make sure that you're delivering the notice properly and waiting the proper amount of time. Step 7 is going to be obviously assessing the results, right? So the results come in. I've never, not that I've been a part of too many, since we've had a pretty good run here for the last 15 years or whatever, but I've never seen a cash call so far that's been perfectly flawlessly, you know, we need X amount of money and everybody contributes. You're always going to be short. And so that's when you want to assess the situation and figure out, okay, what are our next steps? Is there one or two investors that we know that are going to be able to fill in this shortfall? Should we give them a call? Or do we now have to, you know, go to the outside market, and who do we know out there and who's going to either give us a loan so we can fill this hole, or are we going to have to go sell equity? Which, to be fair, selling equity is probably the hardest of them all and probably the most expensive. I think most, if it's something that a third party or the quote unquote market's going to give you, it's probably going to be a loan, and it's going to be, you know, ahead of everybody else except for the lender, and it's going to be owner's terms, and you're going to want to, you know, pay that back really, really fast. So, and again, communication, right? So communicate the results of the cash call to your investors and let them know that, you know, what the final accounting is, how much you're short, because you will be short. In fact, you know, a pro tip, by the way, I would recommend is when you're thinking of the cash call, let's say you need 500,000, you may want to overshoot. I mean, maybe that's maybe not a step, but it's maybe a pro tip. Shoot for more. So if you have a $500,000 cash call, maybe do a cash call for 750. And have everybody put in 75K instead of 50K, because you know that not everybody's going to be contributing and you're going to be short. And maybe you tried for 750, everybody's short, and you end up at 500, which is kind of what you need. So that's maybe a tip that I definitely, you know, seen it in clients that we've done, and something you may want to consider. So if you enjoyed this clip and you want to see the entire episode, click here. And if you want to see other videos similar to this, click here.